Hello there, it's Tom and Magnolia here, and this is chapter 53 of Gunnerkrigg Court, Annie in the Fire.
Hello.
So we start off back in the new room that Annie is in, and we see that Annie is keeping the fire part of herself at the exact opposite of the room, as far away from herself as she possibly can, and this is kind of an indication as to why she's in this room. Not only is she separated and isolated from everyone else, she's also taken a part of herself and kept it isolated but as far from herself as possible.
So what were you thinking about when you designed Annie's fire self?
Well, we've already sort of seen what the fire elemental side of Annie looks like, with this line down her face. But I needed to keep in mind that a large part of Annie's ether form relies on the imagery of her hair. And I wanted to keep that part of the design, but I wanted to show visually that it's been separated out from her. So I just had the idea of making a very literal cut in the hair, but still having what would be the hair as part of the design just severed from the actual creature. And I wanted this sequence to show that this part of Annie, in being separated, is kind of impotent and useless at trying to express her anger, and whatever it's trying to do here is just having no effect on the real world whatsoever. But aside from the visual representation, I just kind of really enjoy drawing the Annie's fire elemental side, so I had fun on these pages.
Do you consider this to be particularly good advice that Sangren is giving Annie here?
Yes and no. So when it comes to the kind of advice that a Sangren might give, I've always tried to present it as the sort of advice that would probably do well for a wolf living alone in the forest, but probably not the best advice for a teen girl that lives amongst other humans. But I do try to make sure that the advice that a Sangren gives, or the comments that he has, do have an element of truth in them, and is the kind of advice that Annie wouldn't hear from anyone else. He has been someone who has given her helpful advice in the past, and will do in the future, and there's more to talk about that in a future chapter. But here we see that she's taken some comments of his and has kind of interpreted them literally. And so when a Sangren says that he sees the anger that he wrestles with as a creature that he has to fight, or a personal demon, that is kind of what Annie has done with the fire part of herself. We see that she's really struggling with keeping her anger in check, and so she has taken the drastic step of cutting off her hair as a representation of separating that self out from her.
I have sort of an abstract question about it. When she did this, was that fire spirit something that was already inside of her, or is it something that she created in that moment?
No, it's supposed to be something that she is basically created, and while the fire has been part of her the whole time, it wasn't until now that she would imagine it as its own creature. As the Sangren said, a personal demon.
So she literally created her own personal demon.
Pretty much, and we see here that she has the blinker stone and uses that to give it shape. So in the past we've seen that Annie's been able to use the blinker stone to represent fire or create the image of fire. Here she's using that to anchor this part of herself to it and keep it separate from her. But I don't really imagine it as something that thinks for itself, it's just a representation of the anger that she's trying to keep bottled down. But once Annie comes back to her room, Mr. Donlan pops by and asks to borrow her blinker stone, because he's going off to talk to Tony. And this whole following scene was done because I didn't want to keep the readers waiting too long to hear about what Tony's been up to, and possibly take a look at some of the motivations that he has had to acting the way he is, and start to reveal what he's been up to.
This scene goes to some kind of dark places. Were you thinking at all about how to keep it in the right, the right tone or the right level that you aim for with Gunnerkrigg?
Sure. I try not to make anything too extreme in Gunnerkrigg, in the sense that nothing is too childish or too outright adult. So when it comes to this little backstory section here, I did want it to be a little bit darker because I wanted to show that Tony has gone through some pretty harsh stuff, and some of the stuff in this I consider to be riding the line on the more adult side of what I would show in the story.
Would Tony have gone to medical school as part of the court, or would he have left to become a surgeon?
No, he would have learned all his doctoring in the court.
Okay, so they offer that sort of thing at the court?
They do, yeah.
Okay.
And so before he left, he was already a surgeon and a doctor. And this exposition here is kind of a little glimpse as to how the court might function. He mentions here that they've offered him access to equipment, and they were sort of aware as to what Tony was doing and where he was going. And throughout the rest of this scene, we'll get little hints as to how the court works. And I kind of wanted the scene in general to seem like it's two friends who have a shared history, talking about things that they both might have information and knowledge about, but the reader isn't exactly privy to all that. And I tried to keep it natural. And Donnie has given Annie the opportunity to kind of be in the reader's role, where she and us as the readers are in the position where we can see two people talking about something without really being part of the conversation. And in this little sequence here, we're starting to see exactly what it was that Tony was up to, in the form of like flashbacks and expository dialogue. This sequence here is the part where I think it's sort of borderline as far as the stuff that I'd like to show in the story, but I really wanted this sequence to seem like Tony has gone to great lengths to search for something and has gone through some terrible experiences in this search for information about what happened to Surma. And in doing so, he's ended up in a really terrible situation here.
And these creatures definitely aren't psychopomps, right?
No, they're not. They're probably not even physical creatures. And the way I imagined this sequence was that if anybody was watching Tony during all this, it would seem like he just went on a drug bender and then cut his hand off. But whatever is going on here actually is taking place on some level, because he is able to contact Annie and he is able to send a message. And as we see in a couple pages, Zimmy is able to intercept whatever it is that he's doing. So I was trying to represent a situation where something is taking place, but not really in any discernible way to anybody but Tony.
I sort of assumed they were like creatures that prey on grief or something like that.
That could be one way of describing them, yeah. I kept the details of them extremely vague, because not even Tony would be sure what they are or who they are or really what went on here.
It's also kind of sad that even though he's such a smart person, it's almost like he got scammed by these creatures because he didn't know how to deal with magic type stuff.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going for. He says at the beginning of the sequence that after he'd exhausted all of his own methods of investigation, he went into this world that he has no experience of. And really, yeah, he just got scammed or tricked by these creatures, whatever they are. And when these pages were updating, people immediately thought of Coyote during all this, which kind of I intended, because Coyote is kind of in that realm of creatures that would trick people, but these are almost purely malevolent versions of that.
I also think it's worth pointing out that there seem to be people who still hold on to the idea that Tony did this all to Annie on purpose, when it seems pretty clear that it's something that he never intended to happen.
Yeah, and that's probably because I could have done a better job at conveying exactly what's going on, but really this entire sequence I tried to show outright that what was going on here was because Tony felt that he had come across the answer that he'd been spending years looking for, which is to say he wanted at least to see his wife again. And these creatures have kind of in a monkey's paw style situation have given him the means to see his wife again, but he had no idea that it would be basically at the expense of his daughter. He had no idea that what he was doing was reaching out through the ether essentially and pulling at a part of Annie that was essentially given to her by her mother. Because as the readers, we know that Annie's mom died because the fire elemental part of herself was passed down to her daughter. But to Tony, that explanation is not good enough. And he has spent these years of his life trying to figure out exactly what happened. And in doing so, almost caused a terrible situation to happen to his daughter. Which, of course, was part of the trick. I'm sure these creatures knew exactly what was going on here and enjoyed manipulating this man into doing something terrible.
It's kind of sad to think about it that way, like an old man going on a computer and handing over his credit card information because he doesn't know not to do that.
That is kind of the situation, yeah. That's, I guess, what would be the more mundane equivalent of what's going on.
Did you enjoy revisiting the scene with Zimmy?
I did, yeah. It was nice to revisit what was going on in Chapter 38 and kind of draw the scene from the opposite side. So what I was trying to show with this scene in total was that at the end of all this, Tony is basically a destroyed person. And he was left out in the wilderness somewhere feeling that it would be better off if he had just died and rotted away. And it was actually the court that came and pulled him back in. And right at the end of this, when we see the scene from Chapter 51 where Tony is teaching the class, but from Tony's point of view now, I wanted to show in the second and third panel here that he is disassociating just like Annie did. And this is just a trait that the two of them have in common.
So I noticed you've included a panel where Donnie just outright says that none of this is really an excuse for what he did. Were you thinking a lot about what readers might think about this scene?
I was, yeah, and I didn't want the preceding scene to seem like it was an excuse for what Tony had done. I just wanted to show the circumstances of what Tony had gone through and what led him to the position that he's in right now. But I also had Donnie take this role in showing this to Annie because he's somebody that knows that Tony may never have told this stuff to Annie face to face. Not because Tony's a cruel person, but I wanted to show that after everything that Tony had gone through here and almost harming his daughter, that he probably wouldn't even feel that he has the right to explain any of the actions, let alone justify them.
I think we can see from this chapter that Tony is not a monster who came here just to destroy Annie's life, which is why trying to solve the pain he caused for Annie is a matter of communication and understanding, and why it is important that Donnie try to foster that between them.
Yeah, and like I try and do with all the characters in the comic, Tony is neither all good or all bad. And now that he's re-entered the story, this really is just the beginning of now building the relationship between Annie and Tony.
But even here, you can see that she's not quite buying it yet, and which is valid.
That's right, she's telling herself that he had his reasons, but I think she already knows that that is not good enough justification. And certainly at this point, it's not enough justification for the readers either. But as I said, this is just the first step in building that relationship. But until that time, even though Annie has some new information to go on and to think about, she will continue to keep the very angry part of herself separated and take some time to contemplate everything that she just heard. And this bonus page is just a quick little interlude that shows what happens directly after Annie cut her hair. And it was an excuse for me to draw the haircutting robot again from chapter 15.
So does this haircutting robot handle everyone's hair in the court?
Anybody who comes to him. There's probably multiple haircutting robots. And that's the end of the chapter. So come back again for chapter 54, meetings and re-meetings.
Thanks for listening.